Hello and welcome, I'm Kravchuk and you're watching Head to Head with UATV. A mission from the International Monetary Fund has begun discussing a new 3-year program for Ukraine. The main recommendations for Ukraine include supporting macroeconomic stability and creating favorable conditions for economic growth. To discuss this, we're joined in the studio today by Vitaliy Kravchuk, Senior Research Fellow at the Institute for Economic Research in Kyiv. Hello and thank you for joining us today. So, first of all, could you please tell us what does this new program provide for? Because we all remember about the standby arrangement that was approved in December last year, but Ukraine received only one tranche of money. And then looks like Ukrainian government is developing a new strategy and a new cooperation with the International Monetary Fund. Why?
Well, extended EFF, Extended Fund Facility, is more appropriate for long-term engagement with the fund.
This is the name of the new program.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there are two main types of loans facilities extended by the IMF. Standby is for more short-term relief, like 1-2 years. And for more extended arrangement, EFF is more appropriate because it offers longer term for the program. Mm-hmm. It also offers more extended terms of repayment.
This one is supposed to last for 3 years.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So it provides for $5 to $10 billion US dollars. And supposedly, as Ukrainian experts think, the first tranche under the new program, this is according to NBU forecast, National Bank of Ukraine, could be transferred by the end of 2019. Do you think this forecast can be realistic, keeping in mind that negotiations have completed right now without any particular results? According to the IMF report, the negotiations were positive and productive, but still we don't know any sort of peculiarities, any sort of obligations that Ukraine is willing to take before the IMF. And well, we have only 3 months left until the end of 2019.
Well, I think one of the motives behind this why the negotiations were not concluded is partly because the government still needed to find out what it wants, essentially. So it's just in the process of setting the policy agenda for the next 5 years. And for example,
for the new government, what does it want? You mean in terms of obligations before the IMF?
I mean the idea behind the arrangement is that IMF and IMF supports certain policy and reform agenda for the Ukrainian government. And one important factor that is needed for the agreement is that the Ukrainian government needs to know what exactly it wants to be supported by the IMF program.
Mm-hmm. And what exactly can it implement? So, yeah, in the introduction I said that the IMF recommends Ukraine to support macroeconomic stability and create favorable conditions for economic growth. This is pretty general. Yeah, it is always relevant for any country, not only Ukraine, but for Ukraine especially. Yeah. But what were the main stumbling blocks in these negotiations, or what might be the main stumbling blocks?
Well, there are a few. For example, one of the priority areas for the IMF policy agenda is the financial sector and monetary policy. In this, there was reported that there are some concerns about the central bank independence of the NBU.
National Bank of Ukraine.
Yeah, National Bank of Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. Could you please explain the audience what is the issue about the National Bank of Ukraine? What is the issue about the independence?
Well, it seems that IMF has some concerns. Is not fully confident, that the new government will more or less continue the current essentially will not change current legislative framework. It provides for the independence of the NBU. So essentially, that the current status quo will be preserved. Well, that's more or less what the IMF wants, I think. Or maybe some improvements, because there is some different views. There was more or less entirely new parliament elected. And it was not clear, I think, for the for the IMF whether they won't change the current framework for the NBU governance.
Mm-hmm. So could you please clarify for the audience that is not maybe very much familiar with the financial sector in Ukraine, is the National Bank independent in Ukraine or dependent, politically dependent?
Well, it's more or less, it's at least we can say that it is much more independent than it was before.
Mm-hmm.
So it's...
But it needs to gain more independence in the eyes of IMF.
I think IMF was pretty satisfied with what we have done in this area. Mm-hmm. There was no additional demand for the changes in the NBU law. So in the recent few IMF reviews. So I think IMF doesn't require any... Well, of course, we may see some minor changes, but I don't see any large demands to change anything in terms of NBU. Just some assurances that we won't mess with what is already more or less working for Ukraine.
So they want to be sure that the new government has enough of political will to keep the reform going and
doesn't roll back, essentially.
To keep a track on this development. Okay, so what are the further and other issues for these further negotiations? You mentioned about the National Bank of Ukraine.
Well, there is private bank, essentially.
Private bank?
Yeah, where you can, there is ongoing a lot of court cases.
Yes, private bank, just to remind the audience, was nationalized from the very famous oligarch Kolomoisky. But the IMF is concerned about the Prime Minister's interview for Financial Times, right? That now it is expected that there might be some talks to somehow to soften the atmosphere with the oligarch Kolomoisky about the nationalization of the private bank. But at the same time, Honcharuk said that he
was misinterpreted.
Yeah, he didn't deliver this comment.
Well, at least I guess what the IMF wants is that government, I guess, would need to decide for itself what their strategy with regards of all of these court cases, what they want to do. Essentially, I think the main problem is this lack of clarity with regards to what they plan to do.
When
there is clear position, I guess, then you can start discussion whether it's good or bad. But I think that there's probably just not enough clarity about what they want to do.
What about gas prices? That has been a main issue for Ukrainians, main controversy for Ukrainians, and well, very debated over issue.
Well, in some regards, it was made simpler for the new government by the fact that there was quite a lot of US natural gas which was imported into the EU gas storages, which essentially depressed the gas prices in the EU quite a lot, which meant that...
It reflects on Ukraine.
Yeah, which means that it's cheaper for Naftogaz to import natural gas, which and so essentially for the last few months we had more or less market prices. I would not call them market, but essentially prices based on the cost of imported gas and not some random cap which is set by the government. Essentially.
So prices are expected to fall. Plus, we have a lot of gas preserved in the storage.
Fallen. I'm not sure if it will fall further, but essentially, so far it's lower than this high bar, the highest bar, which was set by the previous government.
Well, still, there is no heating season yet, so we cannot see.
Of course, there is no guarantees,
prices. Yes, we cannot see the bills. But according to the forecast, the gas prices might be reduced since May 2020, after the end of the heating season.
Well, it's difficult to say what will be the market situation next year, because naturally this large-scale imports depends on the continued low prices for gas, continued abundance of the natural gas in the US, which allows to export gas to Europe for very low prices, at least so we'll see, of course. But if the prices in the Europe, the EU will be more or less low, it will mean that it will be easier to solve the issue for the government without backlash from the population. It's a very different situation when the market prices doesn't mean this sharp increase in prices. It will mean that prices will be going up and down a little bit, but without going higher than the top price, which was before. I would think that it would be more acceptable for the average person, I guess.
Well, and as far as I understand, one of the concerns for the IMF is the draft budget for 2020. This budget has been adopted in the first reading of the Ukrainian parliament. I know that still there is a second reading ahead, and for sure the budget will be amended. But what is your take on the current version of the budget, and maybe what parts would you amend?
Oh, it's very broad
yes,
question. But I would say that in regards to the IMF program, I would expect that current budget is not very problematic for the IMF. It's more or less reasonable in terms of deficits, revenues, and so on. Doesn't have any
deficit is around 3%. Yes,
doesn't have any very unrealistic revenue
scenarios.
On the revenue side, on the expenditure side, so it's more or less okay. But of course, there is the issue that it was prepared more or less as the blueprint was prepared by the previous government, and new policy priorities by the new government were taken into account probably in some areas. But I guess this process from the first reading to the second reading would be the place where this new policy priorities will be taken into account into the budget, and that will mean that it will change significantly from the first reading to the second reading. And so one of the reasons essentially why the agreement was delayed is because, again, the current government needs to make up its mind on what it wants to spend money. What would be the revenues of the budget and so on, and this more clarity would help negotiations at the later stage. So one of the reasons for delays is that government needs to make up its own mind what needs to be done.
Yes, well, we need to wait for the second reading to happen, and also Prime Minister Kravchuk is very optimistic about this budget and about Ukraine's economic growth in general. Budget foresees 3.5% GDP growth, but Kravchuk wants to make it 5% or even 5 to 7%. And also we have this recent news that there is a new 5-year strategy that Ukraine can make up 40% in economic growth. Well, as I said, within the next 5 years. Let's hope on that. But I think that will be nice. the next topic for the next discussion. I thank you for your comments, and thank you for being a guest today in the studio. That was Vitaliy Kravchuk, Senior Research Fellow at the Institute for Economic Research in Kyiv. Thank you for watching Head to Head, and stay tuned for more with UATV.